IVM.
Still, there are times I am bewildered by each mile I have traveled, each meal I have eaten, each person I have known, each room in which I have slept. As ordinary as it all appears, there are times when it is beyond my imagination. Jhumpa Lahiri, an interpreter of maladies, writes about travel, and I sit here thinking that memories and travel are such a weird thing, right? That we often travel to make memories, but looking at the times that we are living in today, it is the memories that we are using to travel across the world. But what does it mean to actually travel and not commute? The guest that I have on this episode today is someone who introduced me to this idea of slow travel a year ago through his podcast, Postcards from Nowhere. He's a behavioral researcher by profession and a slow traveler by passion, whose love for research seeps into how he looks at the whole world, and his perspective of looking at the whole world seeps back into his research right away. You are listening to Litnama, and I'm your host Laxmi Krishnan, and please join me right after this short break as I welcome the guest for today's episode, Utsav Mamoria.
Have you ever wondered how successful people do their thing? How do they navigate the challenges they often face? Are you wondering about the future of restaurants, film, education, technology, and everything else in between? Hi, I'm Gauri Devidyal, best known for being one of the brains behind The Table, an award-winning restaurant in Bombay. One thing my life as a restaurateur has given me is the opportunity to meet with some truly inspiring people, most often just by chatting with strangers at the community table. And that's what this podcast is about. It's about learning the new dimensions of business and understanding how different people swim this sea. It's an opportunity for me to pick their brains and ask them all the questions on my mind, whether it's about learning from their past experiences or talking about future trends. Through their journeys, stories, and insights, I hope you too, like me, will come away inspired and energized. So come, join me every Wednesday with your favorite drink, because this round is on me.
Hi Utsav, welcome to Litnama. This is a really exciting conversation for me to also have, because finally I have someone from after a really long time with whom I can geek over academia, and that just makes me happy beyond comparison. How are you? How have you been without traveling?
So yeah, I am very happy to be here because this is one podcast which allows me to marry my two very sincere loves, one for travel and another for reading, right? And when you mentioned academia, let me remind you that I am a failed PhD aspirant. I've been someone who got into a PhD program eventually after 3 or 4 attempts. Unfortunately, could not get any funding. So I decided to chuck that line of a career and then made my career being a corporate market researcher. So yeah, I tried to keep the research thing alive, but somewhere along the way, the academia bit stayed with me little by little for me to, continue seeing the world through that lens. But yes, not very good without travel. Fortunately, my partner and I, we both of us did get some travel just before the lockdown. So we have some good memories from there. But yes, missing it very, very much and hoping to get back to it as soon as I can.
I mean, when I imagine you without travel, it's so weird because I listen to postcards from nowhere and I realize that you have the research eye so deeply embedded in your life that, I remember reading, of course, I stalked my guests before a recording. So I remember reading this piece from 2017 where you were talking about how design and architecture sort of influences a lot of culture and reflects a lot of culture in it. And I was like, okay, I found the exact intersection where I want to talk to someone about travel, because usually, and I really like your concept of slow travel, right? Because usually I speak to people who are like, oh my God, I visited X number of places in this 1 week of super bomb vacation I took where I blew all my savings away. But I am very curious as to what did you learn? Or is slow traveling like something that is restricted to an Imtiaz Ali film where Ranbir Kapoor will like wistfully stare outside from a camera and sing Ilahi Tera Ji Aaye? Like where do you see all of this happening? So how did you stumble upon your love for travel? Was it somewhere Like, was it always around, or did this is something that you cultivated over the years? How did that work?
So I think I'll take a step back, and if I were to do some sort of a self-critical self-analysis as a person. So I think I'm a very curious person by nature, right? Which is why I think I ended up being a researcher, and which is also why I think I ended up traveling, because that's a way to feed a curiosity, right? Books is another way to feed your curiosity, right? And I think that's where it really started, right? For me, there is this unsatiable desire in a way to see and understand more what is around me. And when I see, it's not just about seeing more of it, but seeing it a little more deeply, right? So just to give an example, the doors conversation which you mentioned is one of the podcast episodes now. It's called the secret design of doors, right? So to me, I've always been fascinated by the way that why are things the way they are, right? It's not by accident, right? Someone has taken some part of thought and, put into it. Unfortunately, when we are going about our regular lives, or when we are about traveling on a very, very short period of time, we don't have time to see these things.
Correct.
Right? Like a good way to, let's suppose you appreciate architecture, right? A really good way to appreciate a building is not to click 100 pictures of it, but try and pick up a pencil and try to sketch it, no matter how bad you are at sketching. Because what will happen is, when you start sketching it, not only will you start noticing details, you will also understand what is your own aesthetic. What is it you like about things, right? For example, people could go to the same building and like two completely different things about it, right? Right. And in fact, this brings me actually to a point. I was listening to some of the episodes of your podcast, and how you had people talk about Bombay, but from completely different perspectives.
Yeah.
Right. So, for example, Bombay Balchao was the one I listened to, and the author, she was talking about how she sees Bombay vis-a-vis a couple of other folks who spoke about it. So the same way, whatever you look at, it all depends on the way you look at it, right? So what happened for me also is that the more I read and the more I slow traveled, I started to notice a little more maybe than the average person, right? For example, over time, I have understood that, I like architecture or cultures which are a mix between the West and the East. So this entire, if I were to draw a line, let's say, geographical line, around Turkey, Bosnia Herzegovina, these are the regions which I really like, because they bring out fascinating aspects of human culture. So I sort of stumbled into slow traveling, not as anything, but it allowed me time to immerse. And when I saw something which I did not realize in the first look, that sort of gave me a high or a kick, right? And that's where I realized that this slow traveling becomes really, really important. And you tend to retain so much more when you are traveling a little slower. Right. And yes, it's nothing to do with the Imtiaz Ali films. I think they probably glamorize travel in a different kind of way, which I personally don't agree with.
Right. No, because even when you were talking about this, I was thinking about the Art Deco buildings in Mumbai, and it's just coincidentally that you brought up Jane's episode, because even as I imagine Mumbai, because I'm not someone who always have had the privilege to sit and look around, or sit at the Marine Drive, I'm generally someone who sits ulta on Marine Drive and just stares at buildings and cars and people, because
watching
I love the sea, but I also love to see how do people look at the sea differently. Because I believe that if you want to see all of Mumbai, 15 to 20 minutes on a Marine Drive should be more than enough for you. Because you'll see someone who probably, and there's always someone who's seeing Marine Drive for the first time in their life.
Yeah.
And then there'll always be that one person who looks at it every time that they've seen it, like the first time in their life. And the joy that I see by observing people is such a thrill. That's the same thing I like doing about bookstores, right? Because if I have to plot a travel map across the world, I would ideally plot it as per what bookstores I want to visit across the world, because I feel like a lot of learning about how exactly a culture sustains gets recorded in these bookstores, which is why when even the episode where you spoke about Udupi restaurants, it made me miss Ramashra so much. And I heard it again today, because I'd heard it a while ago, and that was the time where I could actually go into one of these restaurants. And now that I don't have access to it, the moment you start talking about the cashier and all the photos behind them, I was like, I want to pack my bags and leave for Matunga. I don't know how I'm going to get there, but that's the beauty of travel in general. But I realized that as a culture, sometimes you're not brought up in a way where you are actually allowed to sit and observe, right? So as a researcher, does sometimes it hinder with your travel plans or with your plans in general, where you take some time out to say sketch a building. How does that go? Because I think I should actually start sketching, but most of the drawings would be just books because that's something I spent a lot of time looking at. But how do you generally, navigate the idea of explaining slow travel to people? Or have you had run into conversations where people go on Europe trips for like 7 days and see the entire of Europe apparently, as to someone who backpacks across it for like 15, 20 days, but manages to see just one part of it? Where do you lie on that spectrum, if that is a spectrum?
So it is a spectrum for sure. And I do lie on the extreme right. For example, in 2018, I took a 3-month sabbatical from my job, right? And I spent a month traveling through Bosnia-Herzegovina, right? I spent a month closely traveling through Armenia, right? So my idea is that I do lie on the slight, definitely on the extreme right side. Having said that, I think there are two things which I want to sort of talk about slow travel. One, it is not to do with the length of time, right? It's to do with the idea how you travel. So you can slow travel a city in a day itself, provided you are not trying to cover 5 spots in a day.
Yeah, makes sense. Yeah.
Right. So that becomes important. Second, slow travel is not about, sitting down to a place, looking pensively at things. It's not about that. It's actually about being observant what's happening around you. So it's not just about getting lost in your own thoughts. It's also about being very actively engaging with what is happening around you in terms of people, in terms of architecture, in terms of even urban planning for that matter. Right? I'll give you a very simple example of this. I was in Armenia in Yerevan, and Yerevan is a city where all across the city you will find water fountains, free water fountains, which in the heat of the summer give really, really cool water. Right? Now, of course, it's a relic of Soviet urban planning, right? But what you need to understand is what is the thought behind it. The thought behind it is that something as fundamental and basic as water should not be prized and be denied to anyone. Right? Now, what does it tell you about how a city has evolved? Right? Now, you could walk past by that. You could even drink water from it. Say, hey, it's so nice that water is here.
Yeah.
If you just go one step further and think, why is this thing here?
Exactly. Yeah.
Right? You will understand the city in a completely different way. So slow traveling is become more about observant. It's not about, having tons of money and taking 3 months off from work. I mean, I do have to make a living, right? So it's not that I take 3 months off whenever I feel like. No, it just happened once. But for example, even when I take trips, right? So like my partner and I, we celebrated our anniversary in December and we went to Italy. We did not go anywhere else, right? We only went to Italy, right? So the idea was that at least spend 3 to 4 days in a city. So that because what happens is for the first day or day and a half, you're orienting yourself to the city, trying to understand its rhythms. But then the third day and the fourth day, you will start seeing so many things about the city which you did not notice.
Exactly. Yeah. I'm just thinking about how I have always imagined travel and the idea of slow travel in the West's eyes, right? Because I used to watch a lot of movies. For example, Eat, Pray, Love. I mean, it's a classic about people leaving for India. And growing up, if you ever hung out around Gateway and all of these landmark places in Mumbai, you used to run into a lot of foreigners with their huge baggages and just walking in the streets. And as a child, you were told that, they are tourists. And generally, there's a very different way our city treats people, let alone Mumbai. So that's like a universal truth across wherever you go, that a city treats people differently.
Yeah.
But for me, it used to always be like this very Western idea about, leave entirety of your worries and just go away to meditate in India and get a henna tattoo on your way back or something like that.
Yeah.
So, I don't know. I mean, you and I just spoke about this a while ago about how the West looks at travel and how we look at travel are two completely different things. As a researcher, what kind of insights did you pick up there when you looked at this vision and this lens and its difference?
So I think one of the things which I learned, and I lived in China for 6 months as a part of work, right, is this idea which anthropologists use called ethnocentrism, right?
Yeah.
And so the one thing which I learned very, very clearly was that you cannot judge a culture by the logic and laws of your own culture.
True.
Right? So I think that was the first big shift in my head which I needed to make, and which is one reason I feel that a lot of the Western gaze on traveling does not do that.
Yeah.
Right? So for example, let's take a simple thing which has been discussed no end in a place like India or abroad, arranged marriage.
Yeah.
right? So now arranged marriage is a concept which is of course very weird from a Western setting. But now if you try and understand that what is endogamy and exogamy in India, right? How are social relationships formed? Are we allowed to date or not allowed to date, right? You will have to understand that for a lot of people, arranged marriage makes a lot of sense. Right? Because it's not possible. They don't have that kind of social mobility to, meet a partner. Right? So, of course, people will say, oh, you met someone for 3 times and decided to get married to them. I mean, yeah, but you please understand that you and I don't live the same life.
Correct.
Right? So I think that was the first big learning in terms of, trying to avoid that kind of a judgment from my end. And in fact, I did this whole set of episodes on the podcast recently called China Unseen, which was the idea of to look China from China's perspective and not from perspective of the rest of the world.
You're also writing a book, right?
Yeah. So, and I'll come to that maybe in a little while because it's all about my travel experiences. But that was one thing. The second thing is that a lot of Western gaze also comes with a very set preconceived notion of what the East is, right? For example, I have a couple of
classic Edward Saib debate on Orientalism right here.
Yes. So I've had a lot of people, who were surprised that, I am not into yoga, and I'm like, trust me, I would like to be. It's a great thing to learn and practice in your life. But I am not, and I'm lazy, so I don't do it, right? But the idea is that they have the very, very set notion of this is who a person is, this is what a person looks like, and when they meet someone, someone like me who probably does not fit in with their idea of who an Indian is, it also changes their perspective a little bit. Right. And which is why, one of the biggest reasons to travel is to really see that, there are 1,000 ways of living life and yours is just one of them. And there is nothing wrong or right about it per se.
Correct. I'm just thinking about mention in the beginning that you also love reading and I feel like so many different perspectives in one place. But I remember reading Oran Pamuk's Snow. And he describes how he travels into the village of Kar and the entire journey, the bus journey is described in like great detail. I think my exposure to a lot of travel across the world has been through the kind of literature I've read. But sometimes I wonder what is this entire politics of how even people write these travel narratives, right?
Yeah.
I've heard you talk about your experiences as a story. I'm just very curious as to how do you look at a moment and you describe an entire story out of it? Or does the story just sort of unfold in front of your eyes and do you just, say sketch it like you usually do and look for the detail? What is your general process like when you create an episode which is a travel narrative by itself?
So for me, I think it's the dots always connect backwards, right? I think most of the times when you are in that moment, you do not realize this is a story happening. Right. So what often happens is that you have a good or could be a bad experience also, right? And that experience, at least a certain feeling of it stays with you over a period of time, right? What happens is when you sometimes go back and revisit, you are able to piece through a lot of events which happened at that point in time and a lot of emotions you were going through in your head, right? That first starts forming the broad set of a story, right? When you ruminate over it, it makes you realize a few things. Right? It makes you realize if you think either about yourself or about how you see the world or how the world sees you, right? It sometimes can be very, very personal, right? Sometimes you'll realize that I meet a person who I see that despite all odds is doing so much in their lives, right? So I'm not trying to be one of those, productivity gurus here, but there are a lot of people who achieve so much despite odds. Right? And then you start to feel that, my problems are not really problems, right? I think half of them are just self-created in my head and they're not really things, right? So for me, that the moment does stand out, right? And at that moment, you do feel this is an amazing moment I've just experienced. However, the story is not formed then. The story only forms either at a later point or at when you're reflecting upon that experience.
Right. I'm just thinking, since you're also working on a book, is it always like like one of those Arthurian legends that we talk about in literature where the hero sets out for a war, then the war happens, and when the hero comes back home, that's when the story completes? Right? Is it a similar formula that you apply to travel writing, or is travel writing generally in the moment per se, Now, this is something you can answer with terms of your experience as someone who's writing a narrative, with someone who's hosting a podcast, or just as someone who's an avid traveler and reader of books that are in this domain. That does travel happen like in the present tense, or the travel writing happens often in the present tense, or is it also like an Arthurian journey that sort of brings the storyteller back home, and that's when it completes into this one beautiful travel picture and like a montage of memories or something? How does it work? I'm very curious.
So it kind of varies from story to story. Now, some experiences are so powerful that you want to write about them then and there, right? So because when I took my sabbatical, I did carry my laptop with me because I did intend to write even when I set out. Right, and I did actually end up writing the entire book within the sabbatical itself. I didn't have to write, come back. Only work I have done is editing after that.
Correct.
Right, but what happens is that a lot of times you want to capture the raw emotion then and there. Right, and for me it's a lot easier because unlike a lot of travel writers, I don't write with a brief. Right, I don't have to keep a certain idea in mind, or a certain place, or a monument, or a certain setting in mind when I'm writing it. So I'm not traveling to France to write about Van Gogh. I am traveling to France because I want to travel to France.
Correct.
Right? Or I'm not traveling to Turkey just to write about whirling dervishes. Right? But I'm traveling to Turkey because I want to travel to Turkey. So I think that first of all takes a massive amount of pressure out of it. Right? Because then you're saying that, okay, this is what I need to produce at the end of it. Hence, I need to at least see and feel ABCD.
Correct.
Right? So that's one thing. Second thing is that some of the experience are not something which would happen in a period of hours. For example, when I was traveling through Bosnia, I was in the city of Mostar. Right, and there I'm on couch surfing, so I just sort of reached out to someone who says I just want to hang out. So I reached out to this university student, and he turned out to be someone who studies art history, right? And he gave me a tour of the city through the graffiti of the city.
Wow, yeah.
Right, now that's an experience. Not only did I speak to him that day, I ended up hanging out with him for the next 3 days. Right.
Yeah.
So, and then through my conversations with him, I understood his experiences, his parents' experiences of being in the city, because Bosnia and Herzegovina in the early 90s went through a terrible war.
Right. Yeah.
Right. And, and he gave me some fascinating insights into human behavior and wartime, and something which we just see on television. It's a media spectacle for us. Right. But it's a lived reality for someone like his parents. Right. And he talks about how his parents had to be separated during the time because his father was fighting and his mother had to go to a safe place. And, he was very, very young with them. So ideally, I would have liked to stay along longer and actually get in a conversation with his parents as well, right? Because that would have been a completely different dimension. But this entire story played out for me over 3 days. So nowhere was it really static in my head. But every day, the more I spoke to him, the more unlayering started happening. And I think that's where the story became very personal for me. And also it became very richer for me to write about it. Because there were so many aspects of the city, the people, which I could explore through that.
Correct, yeah. I'm just thinking about a lot of other questions that are top of my mind when I even listen to your podcast, right? Because I know it's a time for a really short break in this conversation, but maybe right after I do want to talk about how do you even look at the idea of travel in different lenses. Because I remember when you were bringing it back to the Udupi episode, because I'm never going to be over it. I remember you talking about the history of Udupi restaurants and caste politics of Udupi restaurants, or the kind of marginalization that happens of spaces. Maybe after the short break, we can also explore about how do spaces also get demarcated when you sort of travel. Where do you go to and what do you leave out when you travel to a place? Because you can, of course, not complete every single part of the city like that.
Never.
So, maybe that's going to be a very interesting part of our discussion. So, stay tuned. See you right after this short break.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to an amazing, awesome, excellent, extraordinary week on the IVM Podcast Network. If you aren't following us on social media, please do. We're IVM Podcast on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. I'd like to thank our sponsors this week, Intel, for supporting us. Great week on the network. If you haven't been listening, why haven't you been listening? You should be listening. There was a really interesting episode on all things policy, episode 413. Do check this out. Title of the episode was How Do We Vaccinate India? And I think that's a really important question in today's time. So definitely do give that a listen. I think you'll enjoy that conversation. Or maybe not enjoy, but at least you'll learn something from it. States of Anarchy, Hamsini Haran's show, she has put together an episode called Why We Protest. Very compelling. Do give it a listen. And finally, I want to just remind you all that, it's a dark time, but if you need a smile, go check out the Smile India podcast by Shifa Mehta. It's in both English and Hindi, and I think that you will really, really enjoy the kinds of things that she's talking about there. And with that, let's get you back to your show.
So welcome back after the rather short break. I know that we were talking about spaces just before we took that break. I'm just someone who's really intrigued by what you said in the Udupi episode. I'm just going to pick that up again, that how the history of how we understand these restaurants as something like that has always existed, as to what exactly happens behind the scenes and what happens in the kitchens is something you never find out. I think that's also history, right? Because history is often shaped by the victor or someone who gets to tell the tale. But a very interesting thing you also told me before we started the conversation was that people very often forget that the gendered experience or the class-based experience of travel is very different than, someone who, like you said just before, that you could afford to take a sabbatical. You can't do that over and over in your life, but you had that opportunity. So I'm just curious as to when you are traveling, right? So can you make a conscious choice to look beyond this boundary, or in a place where you do not know a lot about it? At least now in India, since you are an Indian, you know the basics of how caste and class operate and how is the regional divide working. But have you ever been in a situation where abroad you had to take a call to explore a place because of its politics, its history, which is very complicated than the entire touristy part of that particular city? How do you navigate those challenges as someone who slow travels?
Okay, so I think what happens is that I'm someone who sort of reads about a country a lot before I go, right? So maybe I don't walk into it as blind as sometimes you might find. But having said that, knowing how many surprises travel can throw at you, right? You do end up in some of those situations sometimes.
Yeah.
And while I can't think of anything which comes to my mind immediately, but when you talk about spaces as such, right? Now, this is an experience which I have seen a lot in India, and I'm quite sure it's not uncommon even now. Is the fact that which spaces are accessible to women when they are menstruating,
right?
And I'm not talking about temples, right? Which we already know that it's considered taboo for a woman to enter, but even the kitchen. Right. I mean, there are a lot of families who won't allow their, into kitchen. Now, the question is, when you travel, let's say you're traveling across the world and you're staying at, an Airbnb or, something you picked off of booking.com for a homestay, right? And you can clearly see a lot of very patriarchal attitudes playing out in front of you, right? In a very everyday manner. It's not in a very, I would say it's, you can call it a microaggression in some ways.
Yeah.
Yeah, you can see microaggressions, right? The only way I have felt I can deal with it is going out of the way and making someone realize that what they're doing is wrong, not by saying it in as many words. To give a simple example, I was traveling this is in India, and I was at a homestay, and it was a very simple thing that, the host was also serving food, right? So as soon as my dinner got done, it was time to pick up the plates, and the man just got up from the chair as if it's not his job to pick up the plate, right? And I very happily picked up my plate because that's what I do at home. So he was like, no, there's no need to do it. And I very simply said that if she can do it, I can do it too.
Correct.
Right? Now, I do not want to make it a aggression in terms of a very direct thing that why are you not doing this? She's doing it. But I want to say that if you consider me as an equal just by the virtue of my gender, there is no reason for you not to do this.
Yeah.
Right? So you try and navigate those things these ways, because I don't think taking it head on either would have helped the situation or made life any easier even for the lady in the house at that point in time.
Right.
Right? Because I think she probably understood it. Right? The man, I think, got a little confused at the beginning. I think then he might have gotten, I'm still not sure, to be very honest. Right? But yeah, those kind of things happen, right? Those kind of things happen a lot. And you wouldn't see as many in public spaces. right? But you would definitely see it a lot in private spaces, like homes.
Right. I mean, even when I'm looking back at all the travel I've done in my life, I realize that women face situations so weirdly, which are so weirdly complicated, which don't need to be that complicated.
Oh, sure.
I mean, this is one insight, which is something that still sends like chills down my back. I remember, like in 2019, we had gone to Pattaya in Bangkok with my family, and it was like a proper family trip. So there were like 30 families, a whole group of people, like one of those guided travel group tours. Yeah. And my father wanted to travel that way because he was like, so we are vegetarians, and he's like, oh, I don't know if I will ever get food in the country if I go without a travel group. And I agreed. And this was in a Ramada. We were in Bangkok, and it's like 6 o'clock in the evening. We went for a swim, my sister and I, and we got followed back to our hotel room by this random group of Indian men. And my sister and I were so shocked as to, you've come thousands of kilometers away to a space to enjoy with your family. And it's not even like, we're inappropriately dressed according to the Indian men standard of how should women dress. And you still get followed back to your room. And my sister, she's younger to me, and she just quickly said, I didn't come all this way to be followed by an Indian man back to my room. And it sounded very funny in that moment, but I realized how these things don't leave you wherever you go. I happened to speak to a lot of my friends after that, and they were just like, this is not just Bangkok or Pattaya, this is everywhere. I've had friends who are walking in the streets of London being followed back, even when they are with men or they are with partners. And it's just so difficult for someone to even think of exploration. In one of our previous episodes, we had Nidhi Dugar Kundalia talk about how she stayed in regions where she had no internet connectivity, no contact with her family, and she was pregnant while she was working on this book, which is why her family was even more concerned about her traveling to these remote regions. And something very interesting also sort of disturbs me is how you color spaces in history, right? You've always been taught that a certain space is not supposed to be accessible by nature. So you don't even think of going there. Like, I feel like Hampi has just become a trend recently. But for the longest time, you would go to a Mysore, or you would go to some other place like a Vellore to explore your historical heritage. But what about the smaller spaces, or how we were just talking about Gadchiroli as an example? Your history textbooks or your geography textbooks in SSC schools tell you it's a naturalite prone region, it's a very scary region, people get transferred to Gadchiroli and Nichal Karanji in their life, and you never think of traveling to these places to begin with. So how do you feel about history sort of interfering or interjecting with travel as a narrative? Because you can't separate one from the other. And when you talk about Bosnia and Herzegovina, the only memory I have of those places is World War and the history I've read in my textbook, because they color these places as complicated as possible. How do you then sort of build an alter narrative, if possible, to these spaces or to these stories that are so popularized by history that they're considered truths, and people don't realize that there might just be an alternate version to the story?
So I think I want to address that in two separate ways. The first being that any place which has a certain history to it, ultimately one thing you have to accept is that any form of art or documentation or history will never condense the reality in the right way. Right. So even today, if Bosnia and Herzegovina is known for the Bosnian War of 1992 most recently, right, and in the World War I, where the assassination started the World War I, a great way to break out of that mold is to actually go and strike conversation with locals, because locals don't view their own city from that lens.
Correct.
Right. So what happens is, when you talk to them, they will talk about things which matter to them. They will talk about places they like to go to. Right. So, for example, I'm sure if you talk about India, not every Indian will. If ask any Indian, say that which place do you want to go, not everyone is going to say the Taj Mahal.
Right.
There are thousands of places in our country to go to. Right. So a great way to break out of the narrative of a travel guide or of history is to go talk to people, because they are living the city here and now, and not possibly through a sense of time or a sense of long drawn few decades of history. I'm not saying that does not impact them. It certainly does, right? But their life is not just about that, right? One of the things I've realized is that no matter where you go, you can fundamentally boil down people to 3 or 4 things, right? What they care about family, they care about health, they care about money, they care about living a fulfilling or satisfying life, right? Now, if you just take these 3 or 4 parameters and go around talking to people about it, you will discover so much, right? Another great way to understand a place is, and de-link it from its history, is to see what do regular people do in leisure time, right? Is it centered around food? Is it centered around music? Is it centered around just walking around in public places, right? And that's how you will also start uncovering what this city or country is about today.
Correct. But so when you're talking about the idea of leisure, because the idea of fetishization also lies very close to how people understand others' idea of leisure. Because if you look at the Middle East, or if you look at the Africas, or for example, if I look at Nigeria, because of the kind of literature that is coming out of Nigeria these days, you get a lot of exposure about their culture, their idea of leisure. And that becomes a tokenization, a sort of fetishization. How when you think of the Middle East, you only think of a specific kind of music, or you put together these parties and these nights for tourists, which are catered to, like snake charmers and all of these ideas that sort of emerge from a similar, like this need to understand people from a certain region. Have you seen fetishization also happen a lot in today's times because of similar ideas, or where do all of these stereotypes sort of come from?
So I think a lot of stereotyping comes from how a country is marketed to us, right? So for example, this is something which we were in Turkey, and there were so many shows around belly dancing, right? Now, I'm not saying that belly dancing is not native to Turkey or anything like that, right? But what happens is that because it's the show is produced for the tourist and marketed to the tourist, right? The fetishization in some ways is inescapable, right? You sometimes contribute to it yourself, and there's no denying that. But the point is that the only thing you end up carrying from that place once you come back, right? So let's suppose you thought of going into a country X with thinking this is about A and B, right? And if you come back with the same thing that, this is about A and B and nothing else, yes, I think then that we have completely failed as a traveler, right? We've not uncovered anything which was not sold to us or fed to us earlier. So I think in any travel you do, there is certain fetishization which definitely happens, right? For example, let's look at Germany, right? Definitely, let's look at a developed world for that matter, right? Germans in the love for beer and beer halls in Munich, right? So it's almost a thing that you have to go to a beer hall in Munich and have a beer if you have to have the entire Munich experience, right? Because that's what Germans do. So while one cannot deny that Germans do enjoy beer, whether it's at home or outside or anywhere, but the idea that you have to go to a beer hall in Germany to really feel what Munich is as a city is some sort of fetishization, right?
Right.
So I think the leisure activity of having beer with friends, which happens in homes as well as outside, versus making it a completely must-do way, and these are the top 3 places to go, is definitely problematic.
Right.
Having said that, I will give a different perspective to it. Often it supports local economies.
Correct, right, yeah.
Right? And I cannot shy away from the fact that when these things support local economies without really damaging the fabric of a country, right?
True.
So it's not that Germans don't love beer, they do. Right. And sure, they would laugh at you saying that, you're obsessed about Oktoberfest, and most Germans maybe don't care about Oktoberfest so much. Right. But well, it supports a lot of, local cities and local cultures. And I'm absolutely fine with that, because we have to be realistic that, these are people who need to make a living. And if your fetishization helps them make a living in a decent way, I don't think it is that problematic to begin with.
Yeah, that's a take I've never actually even thought about to begin with, as to how many jobs does it create to even put up a show for like tourists, and like the entire guide culture that you have around monuments generally functions on the similar business model. But I'm also like, okay, this might be a little problematic as a question, a little more sensationalized per se. But as a slow traveler, what do you think about the entire travel influencer industry that exists around us today? Where, you see an Instagram explore feed and you'll see so many pictures of people traveling to places, getting the right shots at the right time, telling you where to be at the exact point to get this perfect shot, or all of that. There's so much more, and I know that you know more about this entire travel influencer space. Is it something that stands against all the values that you stand for, or slow travel stands for, or is it something that sort of is a contemporary and somehow feeds into it? How does it work?
So I think the word influencer now is too broad to be used in a certain way. Now, I would call it two kinds of influencers in the space of travel, right? So, for example, if anyone opens their Instagram app and they go to the explore part and just click travel as one of the categories, you would see that more often than not there are really, really beautiful places. But what is in focus is a really good-looking woman with a perfect body, right? So, a lot of those pictures are definitely not about the place. Right, they're just about the woman, and I mean, I'm not trying to take anything away from that influencer. I know how hard they work to get that perfect shot and to maintain that body. But the fact is, it puts travel in a different perspective. One, it makes it feel inaccessible to a lot of people, and it makes you feel that if you are not doing this, you're not doing it right.
Correct.
That is a problem, right? And what happens is, it is never about the place, right? If you look at most of the captions which go with those places, right? So I don't expect someone to record a 5-minute podcast or write a 300 word on that, but it literally has like 3 lines on 3 words, sometimes not even 3 lines.
Or just carpe diem.
Or just carpe diem or some shit like that. But the other side of travel influencers are also people who are traveling very, very consciously and are trying to make or give a different point of view. Like one of my favorite travel influencers from India is this blogger named Shivyanath, right? And she's brave that she's a woman and she's traveling, and she has also shared her experiences of the negative downsides of travel and so on. But she talks about how you can fight patriarchy while you are traveling, right? How do you become more conscious? How do you fight climate change, right? As you are traveling, and how do you think about the carbon footprint? So I think there are a lot of influencers who are also talking about a lot of things, which are just beyond pretty pictures or just beyond picking off places. So yes, it's a much maligned word now, and for some right reasons. Having said that, there are a lot of people out there who are making an effort to define the entire space itself, right? Because the popular culture on travel we are fed is largely decadent, right?
Yeah.
It's the ilahi mera ji aahe thing which you mentioned, right? Right. It's about those fantastic shots and one solitary guy and Ranbir Kapoor being Ranbir Kapoor, who has been who's been coming of age for the last 10 years in his last 7 films, right? That kind of a narrative, right? But I mean, that's what it probably means to him in that character. But what it also tells you that it has to mean something what it means to you.
Correct, right?
Yeah. It doesn't. You don't have to do a certain set of things. So I'll give you an example. I was in Paris and I did not go to the Louvre, right?
Yeah.
I like art, right? But what I need to understand is that the period of which Louvre has, I don't get it.
Right.
I'm not saying that is good art or bad art. I'm not to judge that, but I don't get it. Instead, I went to a museum which had Van Gogh because I liked Van Gogh.
Yeah.
Right. I'm not saying I have some better taste in art, but I just choose to spend time on something which I like. Right. So I am someone who is into dark tourism. Right. I am someone who will go to a war museum. Right. I am someone who will go and visit a landmine site, or I will someone who will go to Vietnam to crawl in the Cu Chi tunnels dug by the Vietnamese to fight the US forces, right? Because that is an important aspect of travel to me, right? But it doesn't mean that I do definitely need to, go to a beach in Vietnam and, have a picture with my feet up in the air and sun in the background or something like that. Right? So I think the problem with influencers, apart from fetishization of travel, is also trying to uphold only one kind of travel. So one good way for me to understand influencer is that if you remove the name of the person from that account, right? Correct. And will there be any difference left? Is there any sort of a personal identity or a personal hallmark to his or her travel which identifies them uniquely? Right. And to me, if there is, I think they're definitely an influence in the right way.
Correct, right. I mean, that's a very interesting parameter, but at the same time, it makes me think about all the travel literature that exists, right? And if I put all of this on one spectrum about all the movies, all the documentaries, all the books that you could read and watch about travel, to the current culture around influencing about travel, do you feel like the problems also exist on that level? Like, do you feel like you've read writers who also do sort of a mindless travel, or write books with a purpose or a brief given to them that you have to write about this very, very specific aspect of traveling? Because I feel like somewhere around literature, there are also two types of authors. There is one kind that I like to identify as incidental travelers, who just happen to drop you in the middle of a place and be like, oh, so this is how the surroundings look like, but you know what, look at this, because this is going to be important for the rest of your story. I feel like a lot of Dan Brown books did that for me growing up, because they described like a lot of places, a lot of museums or churches in a way where I actually could imagine how they looked like, although they did not have like a major significance to the story. But then there are some who are so niche in their approach that, you know, like, say someone writing about Oktoberfest and they just write about Oktoberfest and forget the larger picture, even if a war is going on, for example. So do you feel like that sort of binaries do exist across all the ways travel is being spoken about? And the second part to that is that, how can we fix this? How can we talk about travel and our experiences better?
So I think one thing that's important, that when you're writing about a travel experience, right, I think it's perfectly okay to elevate a certain aspect of that experience. I think all good writing elevates a certain aspect of either the human condition or the experience you are going through.
Correct.
Right? So, for example, if you pick any book of yours, right, and you read extensively, so if you pick any book of yours, any favorite character of yours, there are certain defining traits of that character which are elevated, right, to bring out that personality strongly. Now, if you think of a place as a person, you can do the same thing, right? However, the thing which you need to be conscious of when you're doing something like this is that we should not be entirely misrepresenting the place, right? So let me give an example, right? I went to Kenya, right, and I went to this whole a safari, right, and it was one of the better ones, right, which are of course far more environmentally conscious and not really pandering to tourists, right? Now at the same time, I mean, it was a great experience. I mean, I'm not going to deny it. I mean, just to see the great migration in real life and not a National Geographic is a right. But I could also not ignore the disparity in the camps itself. Right, there were these massively luxury camps, right, who were consuming an insane amount of resources around the camps themselves. Right, because they were sharing land with the Masai Mara, right, the Masai tribe, the Masai Mara, the Masai tribe, right, and Masai tribes are the ones who run these camps. They're locals, and yeah, they definitely have a livelihood, which is what I'm saying about setups like those. It's a livelihood, but they also consume so much, right? So while I do want to glorify the fact that I saw the Great Migration and it's a wonderful thing to see, I don't also want to completely lose out the track that there is a bit of problem running there.
Correct, yeah.
Now, the question is, when you are writing something and you want to make it come alive for someone, you don't want to get into these things.
Correct,
right. So the challenge is that when you're writing, are you writing for a sense of realism, or are you writing for a sense of elevated romanticism, right?
True.
Somewhere you have to strike that balance. I don't think either of it works. Because if I just write for reality, it sometimes could become so dark that it becomes very difficult for someone to read or digest.
Correct.
Right? And by that, I don't want to put off someone so completely that, I'm also denying that place of economic revenue, which could actually help them sustain their lives.
Most definitely. Yeah.
Right. So it's very difficult. I'm not saying that, and I'm sure I have erred in many ways when I'm doing my podcast or when I'm doing my writing. But that always will be a problem. Right. And in terms of, setting a certain place into writing, what often happens is that it completely is shaped by what you know of that place.
Correct. Right.
Right. So if you look at, I'll give you an example. Turkey is one of my favorite places to go. I went to Turkey in about 2012, 2013, and I went to the Hagia Sophia, right? It's a beautiful museum. Now, recently, it's been converted into a mosque.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now, for someone who's seen Hagia Sophia as a museum, I find it very odd to see it as a mosque, right? And if you go back to the history of Hagia Sophia for the last, 8-10 centuries, it's been a mosque and a church at different points in time. Now, what's happening is that you have to understand Turkey's current political climate to understand that it's going through a phase of radicalization, right? It's going through a phase of fundamentalism and extremism, where such a move becomes populist.
Correct.
Right? Now, we don't know how long is it going to take to reverse that.
Or if you could ever reverse that, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. It might never be reversed as well. But the fact is that if I set the Hagia Sophia today as a starting point saying the Hagia Sophia today was a museum and is a mosque today, right? And I link it to what's happening in the country. That's one style of setting a place. The other is saying that this, in the larger scheme of time, is just another period of 50 to 100 years where this is going to be a mosque.
Yeah.
Right?
Looking at the history and the future, the possible future.
So you don't know the cadence of the place as you write it. So the way you approach that setting itself will define in many ways how the story is going to flow from there.
Yeah, that makes so much sense as to how do you even chart a map, right? I mean, one of the books I would recommend is Nuruddin Farah's Maps, which talks about how the political climate of one particular, of course, I've read it a while ago, so I'm forgetting the exact place, but the place where this protagonist comes from gets redefined into regions. So if it's with party A at one point, I think it was Somalia, if I'm not wrong, it gets sort of divided back and forth. And someone who's born somewhere else but now is a part of some other place finds it super difficult to even belong at either of these places. So how does cartography also determine a culture, determine a life, or how you live like an outsider in a country for years of your life just because someone drew a line between where you came from and where you are now? Yeah. And what you said makes so much sense. But it's time to move to our last question, and I'm really curious about your book. What would we get to see? What's happening? Please tell us more about it.
Okay. So the amount of enthusiasm I showed in writing it is inversely proportional to the amount of enthusiasm I have for editing it. Right. So it's been sitting with me for the last 2 years. Right. It's written, so it's like a good 50,000 words in place.
Wow.
You cover it through paperback. That's about 150, 200 pages at least. Right. Whatever font you pick up. So I'll tell you where the genesis of the book came. Okay. One, of course, there was a desire to, record a personal history, right? Record of what I have seen and what I've experienced, given whatever age I was traveling at, right? Okay. I think the other thing which I found very lacking in terms of all the travel writing I had done is that there was no talk of the negative emotions you feel as you travel.
Yeah.
A lot of it is about how wonderful the place is and how great people are and how beautiful it is. And it is. I'm not going to deny that for 1 second, right? But the fact is that from a personal perspective, from a perspective of people, what are the negative emotions you also encounter, right? Fear, right? There are two kinds of fear. One is fear is external. You're scared of what is out there, what of surroundings. But there are intrinsic fears, right? Self-doubt. Yeah, the lack of self-confidence, right? And some of those will come to the fore when you are traveling, right? And I was traveling solo, so yeah, that also makes a lot of difference to how you feel things, right? Aspects about, and I mentioned my interest in dark tourism, right? So I was talking to this art history student in Moscow, right? And he told me something which really blew my mind, right? And this is something his parents told him, and they said when the war was going on, and often in cinema we see that. The war is over and, tanks withdraw and flags come up and people are rebuilding their lives. He said that does not happen in real life. There is no certain point when you can say that the war is over.
Yeah.
How do you know the war is over? Right? I never thought of that.
That changes so much about how we even think of places and people, right?
Right. And that is when you realize that in this particular space and time, you are very transient.
Right.
Right? Because you are just someone who's passing by through this place and, feeling a certain emotion and, talking about it. Now, what happens is that if you immerse yourself in that place, you will uncover a lot of emotions which the place feels about itself, which the people feel about the place. Right? A lot of times people are in places not of their choices.
Correct.
Right? So I think my whole challenge was that I need to talk about those emotions as well. So while it has a lot of stories which make me very, very happy to this day. Right. But there are also things which I dwelled upon in those things, right? Like I went to this region bordering Armenia and Azerbaijan called Nagorno-Karabakh. It's a disputed region between the two places. And, there are still landmines, areas where people can't go. There are still farmlands which people can't farm because there's a landmine, right? And think about it. It's some of the parts of Nagorno-Karabakh are really, really beautiful. What value is that beauty if you cannot live a simple life?
Correct.
If you cannot farm your own land, right? So I go from a perspective of seeing that's a beautiful place, but for the person who's living there, it's a completely different experience. I think the most important thing about travel writing is that while you have to make it personal, but you don't have to make it about yourself.
About yourself. Yeah, that's right? Very poignant, yeah.
Yeah. So you have to make sure that what you are seeing, yes, it is defined by your experience, but don't let your own experience and worldview crowd it so much that you are not able to see what is in front of you.
Correct.
I think that's one thing which I felt that was a gap, and I could be wrong. Maybe I haven't just read enough about travel, but I felt that was one of those places where I wanted to write, and through each of these, I'm trying to explore a certain emotion. So I've about 17 chapters. So each chapter explores an emotion. For example, I'm exploring home as an emotion, right? How does a person who has migrated so far away from their country but is not living like in the top 2% of that country, but living somewhere in the middle. What do they consider home? What are liminal spaces, right? How do they feel about it, right? And how does that place shape their identity as much as they shape the place's identity, right? That becomes one emotion. The other emotion was, I in Bosnia and Herzegovina, I went to an underground bunker built by the former Yugoslav general Tito. Right. And the bunker is so extensive that you realize that man was paranoid. He was paranoid about someone killing him and losing his life. Right. So when you have that much paranoia, built inside you, you start building bunkers around yourself about everything.
True.
Right? So I think what happens is that when you go to a lot of places like these, you start realizing and observing things not just about yourself, but the world around you and behavior of people's behavior and culture around you. And that to me is interesting writing. That to me is something I want to write about.
I remember that in the beginning of the conversation, both you and I were talking about how memory shapes a lot of travel. And I realized it's memories that has also shaped this conversation so far, because looking back, everything that we spoke about is sort of this very nice collage of moments you and I have experienced in fiction, in real life, and everything across the table. And I'm so excited to read your book. Please edit it. Please get it published, because I've read very few books that actually lead with memory, lead with emotion into the politics of a space, unless it's like an explicitly fictional book that talks and traces a character's life across a space or the politics, which is something that a lot of literature that's been coming out from the Middle East or from Yemen or from the regions around the world that are getting that are seeing the new light of the day today. The Nuruddin Farah book that I was speaking about, I'm right, it is between Ethiopia and Somalia and the politics of the space. So I'm just so excited to read something that's led by emotion and led by travel. And thank you so much, Utsav, for being a part of this conversation.
Thank you for having me on your show. Actually, I should be the one thanking you thanking me.
No, but I think we should do a rerun someday where we just talk about memory.
Absolutely, I'd love to talk about. And for example, when I was in my master's, I wrote an entire thesis on how art is shaping memory, how anti-war art is shaping the memory of Cambodia and its experience with the Pol Pot regime, right? Yeah. And why national memory is fundamentally behind all power struggle. Right? It's essentially about owning the narrative of your country, which is really what drives people to power more than anything, more than money, more than anything else.
Yeah, please tell me you had Bhabha as a part of your references, because that would just make me feel
I don't like think so, but now I think I will have to look it up.
Yeah. No, when you said liminal, I realized that you and I have been in the same boat for too long in academia, where, Bhabha's concepts still haunt us in our dreams. I don't know. I think I'm a hardcore Edward Said and Bhabha fan. So as much as I struggle to understand all of his long writing, someday I will say that I have achieved understanding the true essence of what liminality means. But until then, I think conversations like these will make more sense than the liminal space in between. So I'm so excited to read your book soon, and I hope to see you soon after this lockdown. And until then, of course, I will tune into Postcards from Nowhere. But where can we find you on the internet? Where can we follow you? Please tell us more.
So you can find me on Instagram on YVTravel42, and you can find me on Twitter at Utsav Mamoria.
Beautiful. That sounds great. And thank you, Utsav. I hope to see you soon.
Hope to see you soon.
This is the amazing story of something awesome. Once Chuck decided to start a podcast, and so he did. The end. Okay, that was a crappy story. But I've got some really cool stories over at my new show, The Origin of Things. On this podcast, I look at the stories of how brands came into being and sometimes evolved out of quite unexpected circumstances. And to make it really fun, I reveal the name of the brand and sometimes a category only at the very end. The show is 5 to 7 minutes per episode and perfect for trivia junkies and brand nerds, especially those with short attention spans. New episodes out every Wednesday on IVM Podcasts app or website, or any podcast app or site that you happen to prefer. End of story, they lived happily ever after.
रिश्ते में तो हम तुम्हारे पॉडकास्ट लगते हैं. नाम है फुटबॉल शुटबॉल.
Presenting Football Shortball, a show about three friends discussing our favorite game over a beer. Sometimes 3, maybe even 5. Hi, I'm Shiva, and with me are my 2 sidekicks, Gaurav Sapre and Karthik Iyer.
Sidekick? You mean like Batman's Robin or Van Persie Robin?
No, I mean like Alexis Sanchez, but with a little more skill than just playing the piano.
Ha! Just shows how the best players at Arsenal are mere bench warmers at United.
Oh, thank you, Iyer. But you're a Fulham supporter, so whenever you say anything to support me, I question my beliefs.
Just like how Griezmann would say, एक बार मैंने जो decision ले लिया, तो मैं अपने आप की भी नहीं सुनता.
Banter aside, we will talk match reports, transfer rumors, top controversies, fantasy football picks, and so much more. So grab a beer and tune in to Football Shortball every Wednesday on the IVM Podcast app, website, or wherever you get your podcasts.